The morning sun painted golden streaks across Oakwood Community Park as 12-year-old Devin dribbled his basketball on the cracked asphalt court. The sound echoed through the quiet neighborhood, a rhythmic beat that had become as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. He'd been coming to this park every Saturday for the past month while visiting his grandmother, who lived just 2 streets away in the cozy blue house with the white picket fence. Devin loved these morning visits. His grandmother would make him pancakes with extra syrup, tell him stories about when his mom was his age, and then send him off to the park with a packed lunch and strict instructions to be back before dark. The park was his escape, his place, to practice the moves he'd seen his favorite players do on television. Today he was working on his free throws, something his school coach had told him needed improvement. Swish. The ball sailed through the net cleanly. Devin smiled and jogged to retrieve it, already planning his next shot. He was completely absorbed in his practice, unaware that someone was watching him from across the street. Margaret Patterson had been watching from her kitchen window for the past 20 minutes. She lived in one of the larger houses that bordered the park, a colonial-style home that her late husband had bought 30 years ago when the neighborhood was still developing. At 52, Margaret considered herself the unofficial guardian of Oakwood's peace and quiet. She knew every face that belonged in their community, and this young boy definitely wasn't one of them. She watched as Devin continued shooting baskets, her concern growing with each passing minute. What was he doing, here so early? Where were his parents? And more importantly, why hadn't she seen him before if he actually lived in the neighborhood? Margaret had lived here long enough to know that children didn't just appear out of nowhere. Setting down her coffee mug with a sharp clink, Margaret decided she'd seen enough. She grabbed her phone and marched outside, her house slippers slapping against the pavement as she crossed the street toward the park. The morning air was crisp, but her face was already flushed with determination. Devin was lining up for another shot when he heard footsteps approaching. He turned to see a woman walking toward him with purpose, her expression stern and unwelcoming. He lowered the basketball and waited politely, the way his grandmother had taught him to do when adults wanted to speak to him. "Excuse me," Margaret called out when she was still several feet away. "What exactly are you doing here?" Devin blinked, in confusion. "I'm just playing basketball, ma'am. Is that okay?" "That's not what I'm asking," Margaret replied, stopping about arm's length from him. "I want to know what you're doing in this neighborhood. Do you live around here?" The question caught Devin off guard. He'd never been asked that before, not in the month he'd been coming to this park. "I'm visiting my grandmother. She lives on Maple Street." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Maple Street? Which house?" "The blue one with the white fence," Devin answered honestly, though he was starting to feel uncomfortable. Something about this woman's tone made his stomach twist with nervousness. "I know every house on Maple Street," Margaret said, crossing her arms. "There's no blue house with a white fence." Devin felt his cheeks grow warm. "Yes, there is. It's number 47. My grandmother's name is Mrs. Johnson, and she's lived there for 15 years. "Mrs. Johnson?" Margaret's voice rose slightly. "Mrs. Johnson is an elderly white woman who lives alone. She doesn't have any family that looks like you." The words hit Devin like a punch to the stomach. He stared at Margaret, trying to process what she'd just said. "That's not true. She's my grandmother. My mom's mom." Margaret let out a harsh laugh. "Listen, young man, I don't know what kind of story you're trying to tell me, but I'm not buying it. What are you really doing here? Are you looking for something to steal?" Devin's mouth dropped open. "What? No. I would never steal anything. I'm just playing basketball." "At 7 in the morning? In a neighborhood where you don't belong?" Margaret pulled out her phone and held it up. "I think someone needs to call your parents and find out where you're supposed to be." "My grandmother knows where I am," Devin said, his voice getting smaller. "She made me breakfast this morning. She always makes me breakfast on Saturdays." But Margaret wasn't listening anymore. She was walking in a slow circle around Devin, recording him with her phone. "What I see here is a young person who clearly doesn't belong in this neighborhood, making up stories about living with someone who couldn't possibly be related to him. Devin felt tears starting to form in his eyes, but he blinked them back. His mother had taught him to stay calm in difficult situations, to be respectful even when others weren't being respectful to him. "Ma'am, I promise I'm telling the truth. My grandmother is Mrs. Alice Johnson. She has gray hair and wears glasses, and she has pictures of me and my mom all over her living room." "Pictures can be stolen," Margaret snapped. "Anyone can make up details about a house they've been watching." Other people in the park were starting to notice the commotion. An elderly man walking his dog stopped to stare. A woman jogging past slowed her pace to listen. Devin could feel their eyes on him, and his embarrassment grew deeper. "Please," Devin said quietly. "Can't you just call my grandmother? She'll tell you I'm supposed to be here." "What I'm going to do," Margaret said, still recording, "is call the police and let them sort this out. They can verify your story and make sure you get back to wherever you actually belong." Devin's heart started racing. He'd never had the police called on him before. He wasn't even sure what he'd done wrong. "But I haven't done anything bad, I'm just playing basketball." "Trespassing is against the law," Margaret declared. "So is lying to adults and making up stories about living in houses where you don't belong." The basketball felt heavy in Devin's hands. He looked around the park, hoping to see a friendly face or someone who might help him explain that he really was telling the truth. But the few people nearby seemed more interested in watching the drama unfold than in getting involved. "My mom always told me this was a nice neighborhood," Devin said softly, more to himself than to Margaret. "It is a nice neighborhood," Margaret replied sharply, "and we intend to keep it that way by making sure people who don't belong here understand they need to leave." Devin felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. For the first time in his young life, he was experiencing something his parents had tried to prepare him for but hoped he'd never have to face. He was being judged not by his actions or his character, but by the color of his skin and the assumptions someone was making about where he did or didn't belong. The basketball court that had felt like his safe space just minutes ago now felt like a stage where he was being forced to defend his right to exist in a place where he'd done nothing wrong. And somewhere 2 blocks away, his grandmother was probably setting out lunch, completely unaware that her grandson was about to have an encounter that would change how he saw the world forever. Devin tried to take a step back, but Margaret moved closer, keeping her phone pointed at him like a weapon. The red recording light blinked steadily, capturing every moment of his growing discomfort. He could see his reflection in the phone's camera, and for the first time in his life, he felt ashamed of how he looked. "I'm going to ask you one more time," Margaret said, her voice getting louder. "What are you really doing in this neighborhood, and don't give me any more lies about visiting some grandmother." "It's not a lie," Devin whispered, clutching his basketball tighter. "I can show you her house, it's really close. We could walk there right now." Margaret laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Oh, so now you want to lead me somewhere? What kind of trap are you trying to set up? Are there other people waiting?" Devin's eyes widened in shock. "What? No, there's nobody waiting. I just want to show you that I'm telling the truth." "That's exactly what someone would say if they were planning something," Margaret declared, taking another step closer. "I've watched enough crime shows to know how these things work. First, it's one innocent-looking kid. Then before you know it, there's a whole group causing trouble." The accusation hit Devin like a slap. He'd never been called a criminal before. At school, teachers loved him. His neighbors back home always waved when they saw him walking to the bus stop. His own mother worked 2 jobs to make sure he could live in a safe neighborhood and get a good education. The idea that anyone would look at him and see a threat was completely foreign to him. "Ma'am, I promise I'm not planning anything bad," Devin said, his voice cracking slightly. "I just want to play basketball. That's all I ever do here. Ask anyone who's seen me before." "That's the problem," Margaret shot back. "Nobody has seen you before. You just showed up out of nowhere and now you're trying to convince me you belong here. Well, I'm not buying it." By now, more people had gathered. Mrs. Chen, who lived 3 houses down from Margaret, had come outside to water her flowers but stopped when she saw the commotion. Tom Bradley, a retired teacher who walked his golden retriever every morning, had paused on the sidewalk with a confused expression. Even some teenagers on bikes had stopped to watch. Devin noticed the growing crowd and felt his face burning with embarrassment. He'd never been the center of attention like this, especially not for something bad. At school, he was just a regular kid who played basketball and got decent grades. Here, he felt like he was on trial for a crime he didn't even understand. "Maybe we should just calm down," Mrs. Chen called out from her front yard. "He's just a child playing basketball." Margaret spun around to face her. "Linda, you don't understand what's happening here. This boy is lying about living in our neighborhood. He's making up stories about being related to Mrs. Johnson. We can't just ignore suspicious behavior because he's young." "What suspicious behavior?" Tom asked, walking closer with his dog. "I've been watching for 5 minutes and all I see is a kid with a basketball. He doesn't belong here," Margaret insisted. "And when I asked him about it, he started making up elaborate stories. That's not normal behavior for an innocent child." Devin wanted to speak up and defend himself, but his grandmother's voice echoed in his head, reminding him to always be respectful to adults even when they weren't being kind to him. So he stood quietly, hoping someone would believe him, hoping this nightmare would somehow end. "Why don't we just call Mrs. Johnson and ask her?" suggested Mrs. Chen. "If he's really her grandson, she'll confirm it." Margaret's face reddened. "I'm not bothering an elderly woman with lies from some stranger. Mrs. Johnson is in her 80s. The stress of dealing with this could be dangerous for her health." Devin felt a spark of anger at that. His grandmother wasn't some fragile old lady who needed protection from her own grandson. She was strong and sharp and could handle anything. Just last week, she'd beaten him 3 games in a row at checkers, and then made him help her move furniture around the living room. "My grandmother isn't weak," Devin said quietly. "She's really strong, and she knows I'm here. She packed me a lunch." To prove his point, Devin pointed to a small brown bag sitting on the park bench where he'd left it. Margaret marched over and picked up the bag, examining it like it was evidence in a crime scene. "Anyone could have brought this," she announced. "This doesn't prove anything." Tom shook his head in disbelief. "Margaret, listen to yourself. You're acting like this boy is some kind of master criminal. He's 12 years old. "Age doesn't matter when it comes to casing houses for burglaries," Margaret replied. "They use young people all the time, because adults like you feel sorry for them and don't ask the right questions." The accusation hung in the air like a dark cloud. Devin felt something inside him break a little bit. He'd never imagined that someone could look at him and see a burglar. His mother had always told him that as long as he was polite and honest, people would treat him fairly. But politeness and honesty didn't seem to matter to this woman. "I think you're being really unfair," said one of the teenagers who'd been watching. "My little brother is about his age and he plays here all the time. Nobody ever questions him." "Your little brother lives here," Margaret snapped. "This boy doesn't." "How do you know?" the teenager shot back. "Did you interview every family in the neighborhood? Maybe you don't know everyone as well as you think you do." Margaret's phone was still recording, capturing not just Devin but the entire argument that was building around him. She seemed to enjoy being the center of attention, like she was the star of her own detective show. "What I know," Margaret said, dramatically, "is that this neighborhood has been safe and peaceful for 30 years and I'm not going to let it change on my watch. If that means asking hard questions when strangers show up, then that's what I'll do." Devin looked around at all the faces watching him. Some looked sympathetic, others seemed confused, and a few appeared to agree with Margaret. He felt smaller and smaller with each passing minute, like he was shrinking under the weight of their stares and judgments. The basketball in his hands felt heavier now, not like the tool of joy it had been an hour ago, but like evidence of his guilt in a crime he'd never committed. All he'd wanted was to practice his free throws and enjoy a peaceful Saturday morning. Instead, he found himself defending his right to exist in a place where he'd never felt unwelcome before. Somewhere in the distance a siren wailed, though it was probably heading to some other emergency. But the sound made Devin's stomach clench, with fear. What if Margaret really did call the police? What would happen then? Would they believe her story or his? And what would his mother say when she found out her son had been accused of being a criminal just for playing basketball in a public park? The morning that had started with pancakes and promises was turning into the worst day of Devin's young life, and it was only just beginning. The sound of car doors slamming shut made everyone turn toward the street. 2 police officers were walking toward the park, their uniforms crisp and their expressions serious. Devon's heart started pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. He'd never had police called on him before, and the sight of them approaching made his mouth go dry. Margaret immediately straightened up and put away her phone, transforming from an angry neighbor into what she thought looked like a concerned citizen. She walked quickly toward the officers, her hand already raised to get their attention. "Officers, thank you so much for coming," she said in a voice that was suddenly sweet and helpful. "I'm the one who called. There's a situation here that needs your attention." The first officer, a tall Hispanic man with kind eyes, looked past Margaret toward Devon, who was still standing by the basketball court clutching his ball. The second officer, an Asian woman with short black hair, pulled out a small notebook and pen. "What seems to be the problem, ma'am?" asked Officer Rodriguez, reading the name tag on his uniform. Margaret launched into her story with dramatic flair. "This young man has been hanging around our neighborhood for over an hour, and when I asked him what he was doing here, he started telling lies about living with Mrs. Johnson on Maple Street. Mrs. Johnson is an elderly white woman who lives alone, and this boy is clearly not related to her." Officer Chen looked up from her notebook. "Has he committed any crimes? Damaged any property?" "Well, no," Margaret admitted, "but he's obviously trespassing. This is a private neighborhood park and he doesn't belong here. Plus, he's been giving me false information about his identity." Officer Rodriguez walked over to Devon, who took a small step backward without meaning to. The officer noticed and stopped at a comfortable distance, crouching down slightly so they were closer to eye level. "Hey there," he said in a gentle voice. "What's your name?" "Devon, sir," the boy answered quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Devon, can you tell me what you're doing here today?" Devon glanced nervously at Margaret, who was watching them closely with her arms crossed. "I'm visiting my grandmother, and I came to the park to play basketball. I do this every Saturday." "Every Saturday?" Officer Chen asked, walking over to join them. "How long have you been coming here?" "About a month," Devon replied. "Ever since my mom started letting me take the bus to visit Grandma by myself." Officer Rodriguez smiled. "That's a big responsibility. Your mom must trust you a lot. What's your grandmother's name?" "Mrs. Alice Johnson. She lives on Maple Street in the blue house with the white fence." Margaret made a sound of frustration. "Officers, he's been telling the same lie for the past hour. Mrs. Johnson is an elderly white woman. This boy is obviously making this up." Officer Chen raised her hand to quiet Margaret, then turned back to Devon. "Devon, do you have your grandmother's phone number? We'd like to give her a call and let her know where you are." Devon nodded eagerly. "Yes, she gave me a card with all her numbers on it in case of emergencies." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a slightly crumpled piece of paper. She wrote down her house phone and her cell phone. Officer Rodriguez took the paper and examined it. The handwriting was shaky but clear. Exactly what you'd expect from an elderly person who was trying to make sure her grandson could reach her. At the top, it said, "Grandma's numbers," in careful cursive letters. "This looks legitimate, officer," Rodriguez said to his partner. "Should we give her a call?" "Wait just a minute," Margaret interrupted, stepping closer to the group. "You can't just take his word for it. Anyone could have written those numbers down. This could be part of some elaborate scheme." Officer Chen looked at Margaret with barely concealed irritation. "Ma'am, what kind of scheme involves a 12-year-old boy playing basketball with his grandmother's phone number written in an elderly person's handwriting?" "Identity theft," Margaret said confidently. "They study neighborhoods, learn about the residents, and then use that information to gain access to homes. It happens all the time." Tom Bradley, who had been listening to the conversation, finally spoke up. "Margaret, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. You're acting like this child is some kind of criminal mastermind." "Tom, you're too trusting," Margaret replied. "That's exactly how these people take advantage of nice neighborhoods like ours." The phrase "these people" hung in the air like a bad smell. Devon didn't fully understand what Margaret meant, but something about the way she said it made him feel sick to his stomach. Officer Rodriguez and Officer Chen exchanged a look that said they understood exactly what was happening here. "Ma'am," Officer Chen said firmly, "we're going to need you to step back and let us handle this situation. We'll call the number and verify the boy's story." Margaret's face turned red. "I live in this neighborhood. I pay taxes here. I have a right to know what's going on." "You have a right to call us if you see actual criminal activity," Officer Rodriguez replied. "But you don't have the right to harass children who are playing in a public park." While the officers were talking to Margaret, Mrs. Chen approached Devon with a warm smile. "Sweetie, are you okay? You look scared." Devon nodded, though he didn't feel okay at all. "I just don't understand why that lady thinks I'm lying. I really am visiting my grandmother." "I believe you," Mrs. Chen said kindly. "Some people get worried about things that aren't really problems. The police officers seem very nice. They'll figure everything out." Officer Rodriguez pulled out his phone and dialed the number on Devon's card. After a few rings, someone answered. "Hello, Mrs. Johnson? This is Officer Rodriguez with the City Police Department. I'm here at Oakwood Park with a young man named Devon who says he's your grandson." "Yes, ma'am, he's fine, but there's been a misunderstanding with one of your neighbors." "No, he's not in any trouble." As the conversation continued, Devon watched. Officer Rodriguez's expression changed from professional concern to barely contained annoyance. Finally, the officer handed the phone to Devon. "Your grandmother wants to talk to you," he said. Devon took the phone with shaking hands. "Hi, Grandma." "Baby, are you all right?" came his grandmother's worried voice. "The officer said someone called the police on you?" "Yes, ma'am. This lady said I was lying about being your grandson." There was a pause, and then his grandmother's voice came back stronger and angrier than Devon had ever heard it. "Put that officer back on the phone right now." Devon handed the phone back to Officer Rodriguez, who listened for about 30 seconds before his eyebrows shot up toward his hairline. "Yes, ma'am, I understand. We'll handle it from here." "Yes, ma'am, I'll make sure he gets home safely." When Officer Rodriguez hung up, he looked directly at Margaret. "Ma'am, I just spoke with Mrs. Alice Johnson, who confirmed that Devon is indeed her grandson and that he has permission to be in this neighborhood in this park. She's quite upset that someone called the police on her grandson for playing basketball." Margaret's mouth opened and closed like a fish. But she's white. How can she be his grandmother?" "That's really none of your business," Officer Chen said coldly. "Families come in all different combinations. The fact that you can't understand that says more about you than it does about this boy." The small crowd that had gathered began to murmur among themselves. Some people looked embarrassed, others seemed angry, and a few appeared to be seeing Margaret in a completely new light. Devon felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it was mixed with sadness. Even though the officers believed him now, the damage was already done. He'd never feel quite the same about coming to this park, and he'd learned something about the world that he wished he didn't have to know. Officer Rodriguez put his phone back in his pocket and looked at the small crowd that had gathered around them. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Margaret stood with her arms crossed, her face red with embarrassment and stubborn anger. Devon held his basketball close to his chest, still shaking slightly from the whole ordeal. "All right, everyone," Officer Chen announced in a clear, authoritative voice. "The situation has been resolved. The young man has every right to be here, and there's no crime being committed. I suggest everyone goes about their day." Most of the onlookers began to drift away, but Tom Bradley walked over to Devon first. "Son, I'm really sorry about what happened here today. That was completely unfair to you." Devon managed a small smile. "Thank you, sir." Mrs. Chen also approached, reaching into her purse. "Devon, here's my phone number. If anyone ever bothers you again while you're playing here, you call me right away, okay?" "Thank you, ma'am," Devon said, taking the small piece of paper. It felt good to know that some people in the neighborhood actually cared about him. Margaret, however, wasn't ready to give up. She stepped forward, her voice rising again. "Officers, I still think you need to investigate this more thoroughly. Something doesn't add up here. How do we know this isn't some kind of scam?" Officer Rodriguez turned to face her, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Ma'am, We've verified his story. His grandmother confirmed everything. What exactly are you suggesting we investigate? Well, how do we know that was really Mrs. Johnson on the phone? Anyone could pretend to be someone else. And even if it was her, how do we know she's thinking clearly? She's in her 80s. Maybe someone is taking advantage of her. Officer Chen stepped closer to Margaret, her voice becoming stern. Ma'am, you're now suggesting that either this child is involved in identity fraud, or that he's somehow manipulating an elderly woman. Both of those are serious accusations that require evidence. Do you have any evidence? Margaret faltered. Well, no, but... Then I suggest you stop making accusations against a child who has done nothing wrong, Officer Chen continued. In fact, your behavior today could be considered harassment of a minor. The warning hit Margaret like a slap. She looked around, suddenly realizing that everyone was staring at her with disapproval rather than support. The neighborhood audience she thought she'd had was now clearly on Devon's side. I was just trying to protect the neighborhood, Margaret said weakly. From what? Officer Rodriguez asked. A kid playing basketball? Ma'am, with all due respect, the only person who's caused any trouble here today is you. Just then, Devon heard a familiar voice calling his name from across the park. Devon. Devon. Baby, where are you? Everyone turned to see an elderly white woman walking quickly toward them, her gray hair bouncing with each hurried step. She was wearing a flowered dress and carried a large purse slung over her arm. Despite her age, she moved with the determined energy of someone on a mission. Grandma! Devon called out, his face lighting up for the first time all morning. He ran toward her, and she wrapped him in a fierce hug. Are you okay, sweetheart? She asked, holding him tight and looking him over for any signs of harm. Nobody hurt you, did they? I'm okay, Grandma. Just scared. Mrs. Johnson looked up at the group of adults surrounding them, her blue eyes flashing with anger. Which one of you called the police on my grandson? Margaret took a step backward, suddenly looking much less confident. I was just concerned about neighborhood safety. Safety? Mrs. Johnson's voice could have frozen water. You thought my 12-year-old grandson was a threat to your safety? A boy who's been coming here every Saturday for weeks, minding his own business and playing basketball? But and he's... Margaret stammered, unable to finish her sentence. White and he's black? Mrs. Johnson finished for her. Is that what you're trying to say? You thought a black child couldn't possibly be related to a white grandmother? The directness of the question left Margaret speechless. She opened and closed her mouth several times, but no words came out. Mrs. Johnson continued, her voice getting stronger. Let me explain something to you, young lady. Devon's mother is my daughter. I adopted her when she was 7 years old after her parents died in a car accident. She grew up in my house, went to college, became a successful nurse, and now she's raising this wonderful boy. He calls me Grandma because that's exactly what I am to him. Devon looked up at his grandmother with pride. He'd heard this story before, but hearing her tell it to defend him made him feel loved and protected in a way he'd never experienced. Family isn't about what color your skin is, Mrs. Johnson went on. It's about love and caring and being there for each other, something you clearly don't understand. Officer Rodriguez stepped forward. Mrs. Johnson, I'm glad you came down here. Your grandson handled this situation with remarkable maturity, but I'm sure it was frightening for him. It absolutely was, Mrs. Johnson replied, putting her arm around Devon again. And it never should have happened. This child has never caused any trouble in this neighborhood. All he does is play basketball and help me with my groceries. Margaret finally found her voice again. I didn't know. I just saw him and thought. You thought what exactly? Mrs. Johnson demanded. That a black child must be up to no good? That he couldn't possibly belong in your precious neighborhood? Do you realize how wrong and hurtful that thinking is? The crowd that remained was watching this exchange with fascination. Many of them were seeing Margaret's true character for the first time, and they didn't like what they saw. Mrs. Johnson, Officer Chen said gently, we've documented everything that happened here today. If you'd like to file a complaint about harassment, we can help you with that. Mrs. Johnson considered this for a moment, then looked down at Devon. What do you think, sweetheart? Do you want to file a complaint? Devon thought about it seriously. Part of him wanted Margaret to face consequences for what she'd put him through. But another part of him just wanted this whole thing to be over so he could go home and forget it ever happened. "I just want to make sure it doesn't happen to other kids," Devon said quietly. Mrs. Johnson smiled proudly at her grandson. "That's very wise." She turned to Officer Chen. "Yes, I'd like to file a complaint, not just for Devon, but to protect other children who might face this same treatment." Officer Chen nodded and made a note in her book. "We'll need you to come to the station later to fill out the paperwork." "Gladly," Mrs. Johnson replied. As the officers began wrapping up their investigation, a black SUV with tinted windows pulled up to the curb near the park. The vehicle looked official, with government license plates that most people wouldn't recognize, but that made Officer Rodriguez straighten up immediately. "Expecting someone else?" Officer Chen asked Mrs. Johnson. The elderly woman looked confused. "No, I came alone." The SUV's engine turned off, and everyone watched curiously as the driver's door opened. But what happened next would change everything, because the person stepping out of that vehicle was someone none of them expected to see. The door of the black SUV opened, and out stepped a tall, elegant African-American woman in a navy blue business suit. Her hair was perfectly styled, and she moved with the confidence of someone used to commanding attention. Two men in dark suits emerged from the vehicle as well, their eyes scanning the area like trained security professionals. Officer Rodriguez immediately recognized her and straightened to attention. Officer Chen's eyes widened in surprise. Even some of the remaining neighborhood onlookers began to whisper among themselves as they realized who had just arrived. The Q woman walked directly toward the group, her heels clicking against the pavement with purpose. Her expression was calm but determined, the look of someone who was used to handling difficult situations but wasn't happy about having to do it. "Mom," Devon shouted, breaking away from his grandmother and running toward the newcomer. The woman's serious expression melted into a warm smile as she caught Devon in a tight hug. "Are you okay, baby? Grandma called me and told me what happened." Margaret, who had been standing quietly after being scolded by Mrs. Johnson, suddenly looked confused. "Wait, that's your mother?" But she was just in a government car with security. Mrs. Johnson walked over to join her daughter and grandson, a proud smile spreading across her face. "Margaret, I'd like you to meet my daughter, Governor Patricia Williams." The words hit Margaret like a thunderbolt. Her face went completely white, and she took several steps backward, stumbling slightly. The few neighbors who were still watching gasped audibly. Even Tom Bradley's mouth fell open in shock. Governor Williams looked around at the assembled group, taking in the scene with the sharp eyes of someone trained to read situations quickly. Her gaze lingered on Margaret for a moment before she turned to the police officers. "Officers Rodriguez and Chen," she said, clearly familiar with them from previous official interactions. "Thank you for responding to this situation. I understand. There was some confusion about my son's right to be in this neighborhood." Officer Rodriguez cleared his throat. "Yes, ma'am. The situation has been resolved. Your mother confirmed everything and we've documented the incident." "Good," Governor Williams replied. "I'll want a copy of that report." She turned to look at Margaret, who seemed to be trying to make herself invisible. "I understand you're the person who called the police on my 12-year-old son for playing basketball." Margaret's voice came out as barely a whisper. I didn't know. I thought." "You thought what, exactly?" Governor Williams asked, her tone remaining calm but with an edge that suggested she was holding back considerable anger. "That a black child couldn't possibly belong in this neighborhood? That he must be up to something criminal?" "I was just trying to protect the community," Margaret said weakly, her earlier confidence completely gone. "Protect the community from—" "What, a sixth grader with a basketball?" Governor Williams stepped closer and Margaret instinctively backed away. "Do you realize what you've done here today? You've traumatized a child who was doing absolutely nothing wrong. You've wasted police resources, and you've shown everyone here exactly what kind of person you really are." Mrs. Chen, who had been watching this unfold, stepped forward. "Governor Williams, I just want you to know that not everyone in this neighborhood feels the way she does. Some of us tried to help Devon. Governor Williams nodded graciously. Thank you, Mrs. Chen. I appreciate that, and I'm sure Devin does too. Devin had been quiet through this exchange, still processing the fact that his mother had left an important meeting to come help him. Mom, how did you get here so fast? I was at the community center about 10 minutes away when Grandma called, Governor Williams explained. I dropped everything and came straight here. Margaret finally seemed to realize the full magnitude of her mistake. Governor Williams, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. You had no idea what? The governor interrupted. That you were harassing the governor's son. Would it have been okay if I was just a regular working mother? Would that have made your behavior acceptable? Margaret opened and closed her mouth, unable to find an answer that wouldn't make things worse. Let me be very clear about something, Governor Williams continued, her voice carrying the authority of her office. What happened here today is exactly the kind of prejudice and racial profiling that has no place in our communities. This isn't about who my son's mother is. This is about treating all children with dignity and respect, regardless of their race. Officer Chen stepped forward. Governor Williams, your mother wanted to file a harassment complaint. We have everything documented. Yes, we'll definitely be moving forward with that, Governor Williams confirmed. But more importantly, I want this to be a learning opportunity for everyone. She turned to address the small crowd that had gathered. What happened here today happens to children across our state every day. Kids who are just trying to play, go to school or walk through their own neighborhoods get questioned, harassed, and made to feel like they don't belong. It's wrong when it happens to my son, and it's wrong when it happens to any child. Tom Bradley nodded emphatically. You're absolutely right, Governor. This was shameful. The good news, Governor Williams continued, is that we can learn from this. We can choose to be better. We can teach our children that everyone deserves to be treated with respect regardless of what they look like or where they come from. Devin tugged on his mother's jacket. Mom, can we go home now? I don't really want to play basketball anymore today. Governor Williams' expression softened as she looked down at her son. Of course, sweetheart. But first, I want you to know how proud I am of how you handled this situation. You were polite, honest, and brave. You did everything right, Mrs. Johnson wiped a tear from her eye. He's an amazing boy, just like his mother was at that age. And he'll continue to be amazing, Governor Williams said, putting her arm around Devin. Because he's learning that one person's ignorance doesn't define his worth. Margaret, who had been standing frozen throughout this exchange, finally spoke up again. Governor Williams, is there anything I can do to make this right? Governor Williams studied her for a long moment. Yes, actually, there is. You can use this experience to examine your own biases. You can learn about the damage that assumptions and stereotypes cause, and you can make sure this never happens again. Not just with my son, but with any child. I will, Margaret said, though her voice was shaky. I promise I will. I hope so, Governor Williams replied, because everyone is watching now. This incident is going to be talked about. How you respond to it will show everyone what kind of person you choose to be going forward. As the group began to disperse, Mrs. Johnson walked over to her daughter and grandson. Well, this certainly wasn't the quiet Saturday morning I had planned. Governor Williams laughed, though there was still tension in her voice. Me neither, Mom. I was supposed to be giving a speech about education funding in 20 minutes. Is your security team going to be upset that you left? Devin asked, noticing the two men who had been quietly watching the entire interaction. They'll survive, his mother said with a smile. Some things are more important than schedules. Family always comes first. As they walked toward the SUV together, 3 generations of a family that had faced down prejudice and emerged stronger, Devin realized something important. He might not feel safe in every place he went, but he would always be safe in the love of his family. And sometimes, that love was powerful enough to change hearts, open minds, and make the world a little bit better for everyone.